And we're here with Ken Shelton. Wonderful keynote today. Everyone's fired up. It's TCCA Evolve. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We've had such a great morning so far, and we've got so much more coming. What can we look for when we're leaving today? We're talking about evolving our practice as educators. What do we need to leave with today? What's that message?
I would hope that the message aligned with the theme of the conference, Evolve, is that educators across all roles, whether you're in the classroom, you're a site administrator, you're a district administrator, you're a superintendent, you work in the food services department, you work in the maintenance department, because ultimately to me an educational experience covers everything, not just what happens in the classroom, that everyone will begin to look at how has education evolved and how has it not evolved, and what can we do to better service the needs of all of our students all the time, every day.
Because we sometimes get stuck up on the idea of it's just the teachers, but we all have a role in education, and we all have to play our role. What's one thing that when you were in the classroom that you thought, oh man, the future is coming, this tool is indicative of what's to come?
I would say for me it was kind of aligned with the central themes of my keynote, was the accessibility aspect. At this point now, as I emphasized in the keynote, you cannot have an equitable classroom that doesn't have the right degree and the appropriate use of technology. You just can't. And so for me, when I was in the classroom as a teacher, my excitement was along the lines of the fact that, learning is going to be much more accessible to every student, and if you're using technology effectively, it is accessible to every student every day.
You think about all the wonderful tools that we have now with our Chromebooks, our iPads, all the devices that the kids are growing up glued to their hands practically, and how they're using it to better themselves and better their educations. It's really a wonderful trend that we're starting to finally see with accessibility, because sometimes we just think differentiation and that's it, we're done.
Right. Honestly, the other side to it also for me is that, I share the stories in the keynote that, for me, there were many instances of which me as a student in the classroom, where my contributions were either marginalized or even worse, not even welcome. And part of that was also because of a limited stream of participation ability or opportunities. And so now, there's so many different ways that students can participate. There's so many different ways that their voice can be heard. There's so many different ways that they can, represent their learning, that, that's why for me, even going back to the theme of the conference, Evolve, it's like, how have educators evolved in the way that they teach, and more importantly, the accessibility to the learning they provide for their students? Because
I think if a student doesn't feel they have a voice, or that they are properly represented in what they're being taught, they're just not going to buy into it.
They don't buy into it, and even worse, they don't feel a sense of belonging. And it's magnified when you get to high school, when you start to look at 10th and 11th grade attrition rates, when you look at things like the school to prison pipeline, when you look at things that there is confirmable data that supports the notion that some students just don't feel the school is for them. And I think a big catalyst for that is the lack of inclusion, the lack of participation, the lack of being able to recognize that you do matter, your voice matters, your contributions matter, and that ultimately your contributions benefit all of us collectively.
And it's your education. We have to give that ownership right back to the students.
Correct.
So what do you think, looking on the horizon, we're evolving, what's next in education? Where do we need to focus our gaze to?
Well, there are several areas. For me, my big hope that I also speak on, that I encourage, the decision makers in school districts to do, is to start to break down many of the status quo systems in education that exist now that even existed when I was in school. So for example, I've had the opportunity to chat with a number of school site administrators and smaller district superintendents where they're eliminating tracking of students. Because tracking of students is segregation. It's segregating students in an integrated student school. Get rid of labels of things like, this student is honors, this one is not, this one is special ed. When you do that, that's tracking. And I would like to see those labels removed, because ultimately a lot of times those labels, you can predict who gets those labels based on gender, race, socioeconomic status.
And they become self-identifying.
Correct. And then even to a lesser degree, as far as accessibility goes, you even have the stratification along geographical lines too. Zip code can sometimes dictate success, and zip code can even dictate access. So for me, it's my hope that more and more decision makers will start to look at what are some of the systems in place that create the inequities, that create the stratification, that create the barriers, and how can we begin to remove those so that everyone has an opportunity to learn based on their needs and know that their voice matters, that they'll get the support that they get, and that they will be able to contribute to the collective learning, not just in their schools, but in general.
And that's some powerful stuff, especially in our district, being a Title I district. The entire district is Title I. I mean, that hits home. We're so glad to have been able to hear from you and to learn from you, and we're looking forward to a wonderful day of evolving and seeing more. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me.